we are today, the beautiful Thai temple with the goddess and the elephants, and it's a beautiful day. I'm here with my sweetie Jen, and one of the things that is among the bigger challenges in this terrain is knowing how tightly to hold on to the record of trauma and how much to let go and let it fly away. Part of the challenge is that we're not just one self, but many selves. And around our conscious self, there are these dissociated bubbles. Parts of us that, when the pain got too intense at different ages, it severed a cord. It blew a switch, and this goes into this dissociated and unconscious bubble. And there's also these dual parts of the brain where you have this narrow beam focused part, and then you have this wide spectrum part. You have this linear part, and then you have all these little pictures and memory parts. And the overwhelming issue with trauma is overwhelm. What you have is you have a swell of emotion that's this big, and then you have the ego self that's this big. And when these two intersect, and the ego self is in this big swell of emotion, it is completely lost. Because no matter how far it looks in this direction, or this direction, or this direction, or this direction, the endless sea of emotion is everywhere. There's no land in sight. And so the brain produces land in order to anchor, in order to ground. And it does this by these partitionings, dissociations, divisions, that allow one part of the brain to have a microclimate of a narrow beam focus on something that helps it get through the crippling collapse of this overwhelming ocean. In other words, if I'm looking at the wide spectrum lens at this overwhelming ocean of emotion, it's just too much. So my brain creates a little box and says, nothing outside this box exists for now. And in this box, I'm only going to look at these little emotions here. The trouble is, trying to sail or trying to drive when you just have a narrow part of your vision and being able to only see tunnel vision directly ahead for 10 feet means a lot of jerky driving and a lot of sideways collisions. All kinds of things hit you sideways and you don't know what's going on because you're in tunnel mode to survive. And part of the crisis of trauma is those overwhelming emotions are still too big 10, 20, 30 years later to fully digest. The message that goes on in the brain is danger. You will die. It's too big. You are all alone. Out there. You can't afford to open your eyes. Stay in the little box. But as we grow, when we start out young in this little box, it feels comforting and comfortable. It's dark, it's cold, it's lonely. But it protects us from the wide open sea. It gets us through the night. We don't collapse in overwhelm. We're not elegant in this little box. And as our body grows and grows, it becomes more and more uncomfortable to fit into this box, and our toes start peeking out and our hands start peeking out. We feel claustrophobic and our back hurts. It's frozen, numb, shameful, and lonely to be here in the little box. But out there is the wide sea that seems to threaten so many storms, and it's absolutely terrifying to go out because it's an unknown out there. We just know if we leave the box, we're going to die. And this is the curse of early childhood trauma. The parts of us that split off from the self and live in this coffin of life and death, this coffin that kept us afloat in a wild sea, this coffin that helped us survive the dangerous ocean, is now a coffin of shame, of terror, of loneliness, of hopelessness. It is a prison, and it is a coffin of death, because the parts of us that have spent decades cooped up in this little box are so miserable, they start asking to die. Please let me die. I don't like it here, but it's not safe to come out. Please let me die. I'm in more pain. I'm dead in here anyway. And I don't know how to get out, and I'm terrified of getting out. And I don't know how to function in this crazy modern world. I'm shy. I'm sad. I've seen a lifetime of nightmares. And I've been left here and pushed here, and no one wants to see me. Please let me die. This was my first inkling that all was not right in the world. When I was born, I had two tuned out hippie parents. They'd spaced out on trauma. They'd spaced out on their own abuse. They drugged out. They dropped out. They didn't want any part of this world. They were hippies, and they wanted to create a whole new world. The trouble is, their drugs, their sex, their crazed New Age ideas, their giant size, their childhood traumas, did not make them very gentle parents. They took this little child out into the forest and talked about witches and goblins. They talked about trolls and evil gods. They talked about Baba Yaga, the Russian witch who ate little children for breakfast. They took this little boy out in the forest, and they laughed when they ran away and hid behind trees to see how terrified he would get. They tied this little boy up in a sack and dragged him around. They read the Old Testament, which among other things mentioned God's test of loyalty. The true father would take a sword and lay his little infant on a rock, and if he was a loyal father and had faith in God, he would chop his baby in two. But that day, God was in a good mood. So he said, "You've proved yourself, don't chop your child in half. Or, you haven't proved yourself, go out in the desert for 40 days. Make that 40 years. Wander around aimlessly, without instruction, bored and confused, until I decide on a whim to grant you a promised land." This was terrifying stuff for a little boy who hid in his coffin, for a little boy who had no access to media because hippie parents believe the media is evil. So there's a blackout in the rest of the world. All that exists is our little cocoon of insanity. An insanity that says, "I love you, and I'm going to torture you." This little boy grows up and has a sister who competes for the little attention he gets from these raving experimentalists. And the little boy does what he knows to do, which is torment. Here's his little sister sitting on a mat, looking at him, and he pokes her. She cries. Then he pets her hair, and she smiles. Then he pokes her, and she cries. He pets her hair, she smiles. He finds this fascinating. This is how he knows to interact. But he also knows that God is watching. He knows he's bad. He shouldn't want to hurt his little sister, but he does. He's a bad person. And God up there is going to punish him. Maybe send him into a lake of fire with horrible pitchforks and demons and hell that are going to terrorize him even more than his parents for all eternity. This is too much, so he goes back in the little box. He's terrified, and he goes to school. He can't sit still in this world where giants torment little children, where gods test loyalty by cutting their children in half. It's just too much for him. He's terrified. He doesn't know what to do with all this panic because apparently this is quite normal. He rushes around the classroom. And the teacher looks around. How can we scare this little boy into being silent? And there's a dark door in the classroom that goes down into the cellar. She says to this 5-year-old, "There are evil witches down this stair." He knows all about evil witches. He's been reading all about them at home. She's waiting down there in the dark. She terrifies and torments little children. And if you don't behave, and you are a bad child, you are going down into the cellar. This does not make him feel any safer. He becomes even more hyper, even more restless. The teacher grabs him by his ear and takes him into the dark cellar. It's all too much. That's when the dissociation and the bubbles start to form, waiting for Dad to whip him with a belt, waiting for the murderous rage if he's too persistent at getting any attention, waiting for the dread stories and myths, waiting for the games that lead him out in the forest, the games that send him to his room all alone in these terrors. The games that say, "I'm leaving and I'm never coming back." It's just too overwhelming. It's too terrifying. There's tall grasses in the driveway. This little boy can't run through the tall grasses. They're as high as his head. But a giant dog like some of those monsters in those stories chases him, and he runs for his life in these tall grasses, but he can't get through, and the dog jumps on him, licks him and pounces on him, and he is absolutely terrified. more and more, he can't look up. He can't look someone in the eye, these giants. He can't take in this reality that's so overwhelming, that's being thrust on him by these adults that seem to delight in the terror they evoke. He rushes around. He plays the fool. But inside it's always terrifying. He's desperate for someone safe to talk to. And in first grade, he finds an intelligent, sane, woman. She's a giant, like the others. She's German and she's strict. But she's kind and she's sane. She's not cruel. And he's able to calm down around her and look up to her. He starts learning to read after being so hyped up about all these panics, he can't concentrate. He develops the ability to focus and to read. And she is his first bond. At home, things are still crazy. But he starts to develop at school. Then one day, and she's driving along in her VW Beetle, she has a head-on collision and she dies. He doesn't feel anything. There's a complete numbness and a shame about the numbness. But she, safe person number one, is gone. I won't go into all of the varying torments and nuance that build up layer by layer, but small things repeated hundreds of times have a cumulative weight that are on this little one's back. Lies, blame, shame, shouting, bribery. He's a creative kid. He goes off climbing in the forest. There's a pine forest. What he learns is that if he climbs up this tree, at the very top, it gets thin and soft, and it falls over into the next tree. And he can climb onto that tree and climb up a little higher, and it will lean into the next tree. And he starts walking through the forest canopy. The other children in the community love his creativity and start copying him. But one after another, the parents block their children from playing with him. It's just too scary for them to imagine what new idea he will have, and their children will follow. So he's all alone and feels like somehow it's all his fault. Then the new teacher at the school that replaces his dead friend cannot handle American students. He has fits. He talks about how German kids don't behave this way, and he issues the ultimatum. Dane leaves, or I leave. The school apologetically goes to my parents and says, Dane is no longer allowed to come to this school because our teacher will not stay if he's there. So Dane is off again. No school, no friends. Left alone, no media, at home, in the box. He has been terrified and lonely and angry for years, ever since he can remember. But when he talks, I'm scared. I'm lonely. I'm angry. The world shouts back, no, you are not. You are a lucky boy. You have wonderful parents. You are ungrateful. This is your fault. You don't have those feelings. You're a bad boy for having those thoughts. We don't want to hear about it. Go away. And he doesn't feel it safe to speak. It looks like he's a problem child. And it's all put on him. Slow learner. Rambunctious. Hyper. Unwieldy. Odd. And all these giants look at him and say, why are you being this way? What is your problem? And the focus is all one way. This little boy is ruining all these giants' lives, terrifying their parents, terrifying his parents, worrying his parents, distressing his teachers, upsetting the school. Apparently, the entire world is having a hard time existing because of this little boy, and he cannot speak the truth without upsetting them even further. They blare their loudspeakers at him. You learn to behave. You live in the land of opportunity. There are children starving in China. You figure it out over there in your box. We need you to. And most of all, we need you to be quiet. Don't say anything. We don't want to know. And this is the message. That he's got from so many people that all get so upset whenever he speaks. The family moves from New York over to England. Because Dad feels shame about what the school says about his son. From England, my mom is bored and heads off to the Greek island of Cyprus, leaving Dane in boarding school. He's lonely there and comes later to Cyprus. He's lonely there. Goes back to England. The family goes to Scotland, to Findhorn, the spiritual community. And he goes up there. But in a small house, and 5 children, Dane has become a radical environmentalist, determined that his hippie parents will do some of the things they talk about doing and actually dry their clothes on the clothesline, eat organic food, save electricity, and recycle. Like so many hippies, his parents love complaining about the lack of environmental policies on government, but can't be bothered to do hardly anything themselves that they want the government to do. And Dane starts reading, getting upset about this, and gets into a battle. Every time Mom puts the clothes into the dryer, he takes them out and puts them on the clothesline. Then there's the composting. Every time they throw food out, he digs holes in the garden and composts it. He turns off lights. He recycles things. And this grates on Mom enormously, who has to A, face her own hypocrisy, B, have clothes that take several hours to dry rather than dry in 1 hour. And she tells Dad, Dane has got to go. And Dad finds a goat farm in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri, and tells Dane it's a great place and he's got to go. Out at the goat farm, turns out it's a school for delinquent children. They don't know what to do with him. He doesn't want to eat hot dogs and buns, the standard dinner, so he starts cooking his own food. There is no school curriculum other than putting up fencing for goats. And because he's come from Findhorn and the owner seems to be impressed with Dane's serious philosophy, he just lets Dane do what he wants out in a little cabin. Dane stays there for 6 months. No friends. No contact. No curriculum. And he goes into fasting, meditation, reading, and cooking. Slowly and imperceptibly, the boundaries blur between night and day. And Dane starts sleeping in the daytime, waking at night, reading channeled books, reading Lord of the Rings. And going slowly into a deep and boundless depression and state of dissociation. He finds himself in this big pool. It feels bigger than he is, and he doesn't quite know where he begins and the pool begins. But slowly he goes down into a darker and darker place. Where it seems that no one can touch him. And this is where he discovers Lazarus Land. Now in Lazarus Land, you create your own reality. No ifs, ands, or buts. You individually create your own reality moment by moment by causing and allowing. There is no fine print. Whatever your reality is, you created it. This is a confusing time because down in this pit, where no one is touching him, Lazarus is there. There's a presence of well-being and care. There's a presence of humor and intelligence. And it's reverberating down in these dark places when all the rest of the reality is happening up here. Up here, people are swimming, people are playing games, but down in these deep waters, in the darkness of depression, there's no sound. There's no voice. There's no theory that relates to this place. And yet again, Dane is all alone. But Lazarus plucks strings, makes sounds in this terrain. And this is interesting. Dane starts to rouse up. Pay some attention. Someone is here. This is interesting. Using a small allowance, Dane buys tapes, Conquering Fear. The Power of Dominion. The Elegance of Abundance. And Dane, at 13 years old, having met Lazarus briefly at Findhorn and found him humorous and harmless, now found the Walkman and these tapes to be his lifeline with the outer world. Because while many people touched and made sounds up here, way down in this deep area. Lazarus was the only presence that seemed real. So this began a tight relationship. In the bookcases of Dane's room, title by title, $25 at a time, slowly filled up with Lazarus tapes. There were tapes on ending guilt, ending pain, new dynamics of processing and programming. There were tapes on the joy of sex, the money tape, abundance, the skill, your future self, your higher self, opening to the goddess. Every month, a new tape, 3 hours long. Techniques, meditations, and always the message: you create your own reality. While watching and listening to Lazarus, way out in his cabin in Missouri, Dane started petitioning the family to come home. They had traveled from Findhorn to Vancouver, where his siblings were going to school. Dane said, "There's no curriculum out here. I'm depressed. I'm not learning anything. I'm getting worried. I need to do something different." Family agreed, so he flew to join the Waldorf School in Vancouver. But by this point, he'd been thrown out of one school, gone to another school, left that school for Findhorn, left Findhorn for Missouri, and was now coming back into 14-year-old Waldorf curriculum in Vancouver. And the world didn't look the same. There was a complete disconnect from his peers. No one was interested in metaphysics, philosophy, very little interest in the environment, and there was very little questioning going on about anything. Meanwhile, Dane was full of questions that were very difficult to answer. At Findhorn, he had learned about attunement. This was a process that could take a complete group of strangers at odds with each other on a mental level, wanting completely opposite thing, and in a matter of 20 minutes, using a focalizing ritual, bring them with zero discussion or controversy or argument or tension into complete alignment. Dane has never seen anything before or since. A magnificent piece of technology that could theoretically lead to community, global, national peace. That was going on at Findhorn. He'd listened to Sam Keen talk about fire in the belly and faces of the enemy. He'd taken a workshop there about creating your own reality. He was learning about Lazarus. He was reading Seth. He was reading interesting books. He had been to Cyprus. He'd lived in luxury and been in misery in Cyprus. He'd been alone. He'd been at home. There were just so many experiences and so many pros and cons, and he felt overwhelmed. What do I do with all of this? Meanwhile, most of the school curriculum did not make any sense. Having tasted a little bit of the world out there, he didn't see anyone using algebra. He didn't see history being referred to in any of these experiences. All of the questions that he had in school were either patronized or answered inadequately. Nobody wanted to think. And there was another thing. As he was trying to muddle through all this and escape this very big field of depression, he felt battered by the hectic space and the hectic pace of modern life. Battered by homework, battered by the constant message to speed up nothing. Hurry up and do this, but don't ask why. Why are we doing this? Why not this? How's this going to relate to our life? What's this based on? There's no time to explore how or why or any of it. There's no time to have feelings about anything. We've got to hurry up. There's no time. Well, Lazarus had talked about this. Time is an illusion. We all have our own amount of time. It just didn't seem to add up. But what was very clear was there was no way he was going to think and figure anything out fitting into the school day. And there was also the depressing ritual of depending on parents for transportation. They would be late, they would humiliate him, they would push him around, they would try and draw him out. Whatever it was hell in the car. And every day it had to be that way. He wanted nothing to do with it. So he went AWOL at school again. But right back into the He asked advice of an anthroposophical doctor. That's a Waldorf doctor. She said, Dane, get a routine. So he did. There was no routine in his house. He had no school. But he created a document with set meal times, sleep times, and activities. This document was his lifeline out of the pit of depression. In life, emotionally, mentally, there were no boundaries. There was no respect for personal space. Took incredible tenacity and single-minded focus. He ate meals to the minute. He slept to the minute. He took naps to the minute. He journaled to the minute. And this brought stability, and it allowed the little box to become the bigger box of the routine, which slowly evolved into a highly regulated structure of yoga, poetry, power naps, listening to motivational tapes, walks, cooking, cleaning, meditation, dream work, goals and goal writing, journals and journalistic assessment, listening to Lazarus, reading Seth, and listening to the BBC World Service. These happened in 20-minute to 60-minute increments, and slowly pulled him out of the boundless state to a sense of clear container and stability. But it was a box. No one could interface with it except one woman for 2 hours a week he took a walk with, in the slot for the walk. There was so much chaos around, and it was so dissociative and easy to get lost, that if he didn't cling tightly and hold on to every minute, every single day, the whole thing felt like it would collapse, and he would be all alone in the pit again. So he held on tightly and choreographed every minute of the day. Because the day was filled well with goals, journaling, thinking, because the goals were productive, he advanced incredibly rapidly. It's a rapid acceleration to a peak speed, which led to self-awareness, self-mastery, time management, and because he was studying everything in the Nightingale Conant Corporation's library, from Earl Nightingale to Dennis Waitley to Brian Tracy to Napoleon Hill, and many others, including Zig Ziglar, Wayne Dyer, because he was studying these things, because he was doing yoga, because he was doing dream work and poetry, and because the goals that he set for education and stuff, it saw him pivoting and accelerating well past the students that last time he was school, he had nothing to do with and wanted nothing to do with. Meanwhile, the family situation in the house was deteriorating. Dad's affairs and lies and torments had brought my mother to hate and resentful dependency. Dad's insecurity, he was emotionally 3 to 5 years old, led him to just torment, humiliate, and aggravate everyone and play the victim. Mom's hypocrisy was more evident than ever. And both parents put the children in the middle to take shots at one another. They were obsessed with making the other feel bad by using the children. This was completely diverging from everything I was interested in learning about. But there was one distressing thing. You create your reality, i.e., I was somehow writing the script that my parents had chosen. I had chosen these parents prior to this lifetime. They were an illusion, but they were acting all this out because of me, a 14-year-old child, locked in my room, doing my routine. Lazarus was my lifeline in so many ways, and yet this did not add up. I did not remember choosing my parents. I had no idea why I would choose them if I had remembered. I didn't like them. I was disgusted by them. I felt sick of taking care of them on so many levels, mentally and emotionally, and physically. And the best I could do was partition myself emotionally, mentally, and physically. Calling my parents by name, Michael and Sherilyn. Locking my room. Not borrowing or taking anything, which was very unusual from anyone else in the family, but not allowing anything of mine to be borrowed or taken. Borrowed meaning taken when I'm not there. And using earphones to block out the shouting. I felt helpless, enraged, terrified, and incredibly alone, and eventually violent. But I realized from my metaphysics, violence would not do anything. So I wrote poetry. Thousands of poems, processing it. I worked on my routine. I endured it for 2 more years, regularly contemplating suicide. trying to imagine how I could leave, and watching my parents torture my siblings, and watching my siblings protect my parents' right to torture them. In other words, if I championed my siblings, I became the enemy not only of my parents, but of my siblings, who were violently protective of my parents despite abusing them terribly. And that was so I cut the cord. In order to cut the cord and become non-reactive, I had to shut down emotion and affect, which I did. My voice became flat. My interactions were transactional. In the rare occasion when my parents would pay any attention, usually it was my dad, I would begin, "What do you want, Michael?" He says, "Oh, I just want to talk to you." What about?" "Well, I just want to talk." "Well, what do you want?" I want to know if you're okay." "Well, are you willing and able to do anything? I mean, like, are you gonna do an hour to improve my life if I'm not okay? Are you gonna give me $100? I mean, is there anything behind this other than pretense?" That wouldn't last very long, so he would leave me alone for another year. I cut off the tie. I would emerge from my room to cook. And as soon as I could, I left to stay at a friend's. But I could not cope without my strict routine. That's what got me through. The strict routine was judged and resented by my friend's husband. He gave me a hint that I didn't get, that I would not be welcome there anymore. And when I showed up one day, he said, "You can't come here." And I was terrified and did not know what to do. And I knew what was facing me without my routine, and it terrified me that no one was even interested in what I was staving off with my routine. They were so busy judging it. And this was my first depressing glimpse at the endless projection that has been thrown at my behavior my whole life, without any patience, interest, or desire to understand, and with judgment and condemnation at every turn. This was very traumatic, being thrown out. Mostly because if I was thrown out, how could I control my routine? And if I didn't have my routine and that fell apart, I was all alone in the world, inches away from this void that my routine was protecting me from. And with no support, just an entire universe of teachers, family, supposed friends, and watchers who wanted me to go away because I was different and odd. I pivoted, staying at another friend's, and trying to find organic farms that I could mentor on, who would not react to the brittleness of my boundaries, which kept me safe. It was very difficult. I felt frightened at every point because no one understood the importance of the boundaries. Nobody wanted to. Nobody wanted to respect them. And yet I felt like I didn't have the strength to fully support myself. But at the same time, I've got my philosophy, which is I'm creating my own reality, but I feel completely powerless. And I feel brittle and inches away from collapse.